Good morning. Again, my name is Jennifer Mooy. I'm very excited to be here because I'm not an agricultural specialist. I'm a generalist. I have a wonderful job title. I'm the Climate Adaptation Project Manager, and that means that I get to work on climate adaptation across many different sectors. Agriculture certainly being one of those, but I work with state agencies on state housing, on transportation, on public health, many different sectors. So I get to know a little bit about a lot of things, and as people often say, that's dangerous. But I'm going to talk about a project that we did in Delaware to develop a statewide climate change impact assessment. This was a report that we released in 2014. It took us about almost 2 years to put it together. And I know that many people here are from states that have similar reports. Many states in the Northeast, probably all of the Northeastern states now, have some kind of climate assessment, a vulnerability assessment, or a impact assessment, or a climate action plan of some kind. And so our experience may be similar in some ways, different than your experience. But we started this project in 2012 or so, and although that might seem a little dated now, this is information that still has relevance and it still has use in our state. Probably you have similar experiences again in your states. But part of the reason I wanted to bring it to this conference today is to be thinking about how can this science be used to help inform decision making and action, and particularly in terms of adaptation on the ground. So some of the reasons that we started this project was, again, it's probably similar to many other states. We wanted to have a summary of the best available climate science. This was, again, 2012, 2013. There were a lot of really good resources coming out of the U.S. Global Change Research Program. The third National Climate Assessment was in process. IPCC reports were coming out. But these were scientific reports that were not necessarily accessible or readable to a wide range of people that we wanted to get this information into their hands. We also wanted to make it Delaware specific. Even though we're a small state, people in Delaware really want to see Delaware information. They want to see something that is really as close to home as possible. And although Delaware is considered part of the Northeast region, in some ways, geographically, in terms of our climate and our agricultural economy, we're sort of more in a transition zone between the Southeast and the Northeast. So some of the things, even in the regional assessments for the National Climate Assessment, don't necessarily fit Delaware. The changes to the maple syrup industry, for example, not very relevant for us. So it was important to have climate science that could be accessible to non-scientist readers and to be Delaware specific. We had a wonderful team of people working on this project. A lot of it was sort of the day-to-day work was done by staff in our division, but we had an exceptional steering committee. Some of our steering committee members are actually here today. And we had a sort of an equal balance in our steering committee of academic scientists and practitioners from state agencies. And we also had a lot of subject matter experts that provided input through interviews and by reviewing drafts of the report. We had technical expertise from our state climatologist's office, working on the analysis of historic trends and doing a lot of quality control on the data from weather stations. And then we also had Dr. Catherine Hayhoe from Texas Tech doing downscaled climate projections specifically for Delaware. So the climate assessment is kind of two main parts. There's kind of the quantitative and qualitative sides of our climate impact assessment include understanding Delaware's climate. And again, this is looking both at the past and at the future, using historic observational data to understand the trends for temperature and precipitation, and then using downscaled projections with global climate models to understand some of these climate indicators. We have over 150 indicators of annual, seasonal averages, extremes, and so forth. And so there's a lot of data that was generated from this project, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So then the other side of the assessment is really thinking about how are these climate changes, the trends and the projections that we're seeing, how does that actually affect resources in the state? And agriculture was one of 5 sector chapters that we included. Agriculture was one, public health, infrastructure, water resources, and ecosystems and wildlife were the other ones. So in each of these chapters, we kind of looked at, now that we have this sort of the Delaware climate story, what does that mean for this particular sector? Looking at what are the resources specific to Delaware for that sector, and then doing a lot of the literature review, similar to what was done for the National Climate Assessment, looking at peer-reviewed scientific literature to say, how are these changes affecting agriculture broadly across the US? So we took a broad view initially because even though our interest was in agriculture in Delaware, we don't work in an isolated world. How agriculture operates is also very dependent on a larger regional and national picture, particularly when you look at things like supply chain and so forth. Another point that I wanted to make sure to touch on was that we also looked at external stressors. Although this was a climate change impact assessment, we know that climate change doesn't operate in isolation of other factors. Other stressors are influenced by and influence how government regulation, land use trends, labor availability, all sorts of things can be external stressors that influence agriculture and forestry. So then we take kind of a narrower look at how does all this information help us understand the current and potential impacts in Delaware to our agriculture and forestry resources. And again, this was part of the assessment that was really strongly informed by many, many different subject matter experts. We had a lot of folks from our cooperative extension, Sea Grant, our faculties from the University of Delaware and Delaware State University, helping to shape this. I think this is probably in some ways the strongest chapter in the assessment because of the number of people and the range of expertise that we had commenting on this. One part of the assessment, which I think is in some ways the best part, but it was sort of the earliest foray into talking about adaptation, was to include some stories highlighting adaptation strategies that were being used to address some of these climate change impacts around temperature, around precipitation, around sea level rise. So some of these kind of sidebars in the agriculture chapter focus on things that you're going to hear a lot more about today. I know Kevin Brinson's going to be talking about the irrigation management system. I think probably somebody here is familiar with some of the poultry house design changes that have been made, and also salt tolerant crops for areas that have been impacted by sea level rise or by salinization in irrigation water. So those were some of the early stories that we gathered in this impact assessment to talk about adaptation. The impact assessment is not wholly on adaptation, but it's kind of starting to get towards how can the science inform the decision making and the strategies that we use to address these changing conditions. So what have we been doing since 2014 and the release of this report? We've of course been trying to get it out into the hands of people who can use this information, but we know that this is science information that has been sort of summarized for a non-technical audience. It's not for a general reader, but it's a useful resource. But there are going to be practitioners that need more technical information and practitioners that need less technical information. So a couple of things that we've done since the report came out, the assessment came out, was we worked with the University of Delaware through the State Climatologist's Office to develop a web portal to make all the data that was created through the downscaling analysis, Dr. Hayhoe's work, make that accessible. So instead of looking at the climate assessment, which has a lot of nice, lovely bar graphs, we actually have a place where you can go and you can look at specific data for particular weather stations, for particular time periods, for many different climate indicators. We also know that there's a lot of interest in flood mitigation and flood risk adaptation practices, and of course there's growing interest in nature-based solutions. And so we, as part of a work group that was looking at flood risk actions for the state in siting and design guidance for state-funded projects, we also came up with this green infrastructure primer, which again is looking at both landscape scale and site scale practices. Many of the site scale practices that are described in here are very similar to or the same as many of the agricultural BMPs. So this has been a pretty popular item, and it gets a lot of interest at both master gardener functions as well as some of the, kind of our state fair attendees and that sort of thing. So that's really what I wanted to share with you today, was to kind of give a very quick overview of this impact assessment, why we did it, how we did it, and how it can continue to be useful. But really what I'm here today to learn about is, from the adaptation experiences that you're all bringing to this conference, what do we need to be doing next? What can we be doing to provide data, information, and tools that practitioners and people in the field can use to, again, help bring better science into decision making? Thank you.